This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello there and welcome to Global Business Africa. We'll be giving you insight into Africa's business and financial markets. I'm Uche Okoronkwo coming to you from Kenya's capital, Nairobi. Here's a look at what's coming up on today's show. South Africa eases lockdown restrictions as the country tries to rescue its battered economy. The price of oil jumps on some signs of pickup in fuel demand. And Egypt's wheat farming is one of the few sectors reaping the rewards during the coronavirus pandemic. Well, our starting point tonight is in South Africa, where the government has started to gradually loosen one of the world's strictest COVID-19 lockdowns. Africa's most industrialized economy is allowing some industries to resume operations. That's after 5 weeks of restrictions that plunged its already struggling economy deeper into turmoil. Now, mining, steel production and clothing retail are amongst the industries permitted to reopen factories. Restaurants will also open, but only for takeaways, deliveries. With over 5,600 confirmed cases and 103 fatalities so far, South Africa has the continent's highest COVID-19 death toll. Now in Ghana, cases of COVID-19 continue to increase after the government eased lockdown restrictions, allowing businesses to reopen in the country. Now, Ghana has recorded more than 2,000 cases so far. The government has made wearing of face masks compulsory in order to contain further spread of the virus. Here's CGTN's Nabil Ahmed Rufai reporting from Accra.
Business activities are gradually picking up in the commercial hub of Accra after the government eased the COVID-19 lockdown. Edward Befi imports fabrics from China and Nigeria. He says although he can now open his shop after shutting it for weeks due to the pandemic, business is slow.
These fabrics are from the old stock we imported in December, so people are not interested in buying. We are unable to import new ones because of the border closure and flight restrictions.
Many businesses were hit hard when the government locked down parts of the country to contain the spread of the coronavirus.
People staying at home won't help anything. It won't help the situation. It's going to change to hunger virus. So with people working, maintaining the social distance, everybody is on face mask, following the directives, I think it's okay.
While the government has relaxed the lockdown, wearing face masks is now compulsory for everyone. But people are finding it difficult to practice physical distancing.
Despite easing the lockdown restrictions, Ghana's revenue generation continued to decline due to a shortfall in domestic taxes. The government says it will take 3 years for the economy to recover from the impact of the coronavirus pandemic.
The country's COVID-19 infections increased after the lockdown was eased, but the government says it's putting measures in place to contain the spread of the virus.
We will pursue vigorously our strategy of enhanced 3 T's, i.e. tracing and testing, to allow us to identify infected persons and isolating and treating them. It is the surest way to root out the virus.
But many people who have opened up their businesses after the lockdown still have fears of a further spread of the coronavirus. They want the government to strictly enforce social distancing at all public places. Nabil Ahmed Rufai, CGTN, Accra, Ghana.
Meanwhile, Nigeria's government has announced it will begin easing lockdown restrictions from next week. Many businesses there are gearing up to resume operations, and CGTN's Deji Batmus reports on some of the precautionary measures that they're considering to keep their employees safe.
Many Nigerians are looking forward to the resumption of business. One of them, Johnson Chukwu. He runs an investment bank in Lagos and has not been to work since the lockdown was imposed. He says when his office reopens, its operations would be radically different.
Only senior management staff should come to the office, only those who have their own personal offices should come to the office, and only those who have their own personal cars can come to the office. So in that case, we reduce the possibility of infection by those who will have to enter commuter buses to come to the office. We ask them to stay at home. And then we also insisted that we're not going to have direct face-to-face meetings, that even as you sit in your office and your colleagues sit in the next office, all meetings should either be by telephone or by virtual platforms like Zoom, Cisco Webinar, and any of those platforms.
Businesses are likely to be putting in place one layer of protection or the other as they resume operation. For Adedayo Dunlana, who runs a Korea startup, is already taking precautionary measures to ensure the safety of his staff. At the outbreak of the disease, he shut down operations and asked all his employees to self-quarantine for 14 days.
And then immediately we could confirm that we had a doctor come into the office to check us, test us, not the COVID test, I mean like the basic test to be sure that you don't have the COVID symptoms. And then immediately we got green lights on that. We decided to come back to work, and then we started rendering services again. As of today, I know there are about 9 or 10. So we've had to cut down the numbers. And remember I told you, we've been working in shifts. So that has helped us in itself manage operating costs and watch our cost effectiveness too.
COVID-19 has taken a toll on the finances of businesses, and it's also going to redefine the way many operate. And until a vaccine is found, life may never be the same again. Not for individuals, and certainly not for businesses. Dejibadmo, CGTN, Lagos, Nigeria.
Now, of course, there's been a lot of back and forth about the impact of these lockdowns on Africa's economies. Well, let's get into the debate with George Bodo. He is a director at Call Street Research and Analytics. He joins us now via Skype. Great to have you on the show with us, George. Now, of course, experts are warning that trade movement restrictions as well simply don't work in Africa, where, of course, a large segment of the population leave home to eke out a living on a daily basis. So what for you has been the economic cost of these restrictions on African economies versus the cost of coronavirus and the spread of the virus on African economies?
Yeah, thank you. You're right, actually. A number in most sub-Saharan African countries, you have a huge population, good population that eke their living out of the informal sector. And that essentially means that people have to get out of their houses every day for them to get something to eat. If you talk, for instance, Kenya, you're looking at about 10, 12 million households that have to literally get out of their houses every day for them to get something to eat at the end of the day. Now, when you talk about lockdown, Europe style, where essentially there's no absolute venturing out. Now, that doesn't bode well for the financial well-being of a good portion of households in Kenya and a number of African countries. So essentially, I think it has been a delicate balancing act between enforcing a lockdown, because this is largely a public health crisis, between enforcing a lockdown and the economic impact of it. For instance, South Africa has had to revise the extent of its lockdown because it was almost threatening to cause a social problem for its population. Even in Kenya today, they are unable to enforce a full lockdown because of that fact that you have a huge population of households that have to literally get out of their house every day to get a living. So essentially, I think for a number of African governments, including Kenya, it has been a delicate balancing act.
Well, George, most sectors have been impacted in some way by the coronavirus pandemic. Now, what industries have you seen that have been hit the hardest by the spread of the coronavirus and, of course, the restrictions that have been put in place?
Top of the list, obviously, is travel and tourism, and attached to it is aviation. You have, for instance, a number of airlines that in the continent that were already, before the COVID crisis, were having financial problems, cash flow problems, and South African Airways is top of the list. Kenya is one of them. So this has exacerbated the situation for them. Travel and tourism, you have a number of countries, Kenya being one of them, that derive a huge portion of foreign exchange earnings from tourism. So it's been hardly hit. Apart from that, you also have, and this is more specific to Kenya, is the horticultural sector that employs almost close to 400,000 people, earning about in excess of $1 billion last year. They are unable to export cut flowers to Netherlands and UK because obviously there's no demand in those markets. Of course, also the small and medium enterprises segment has also been hit. A number of those SMEs have had to shut down their businesses because of these lockdown measures. And SME is a very critical sector for most of countries in South Africa because it powers growth, it powers employment. So yeah, that's where the most visible impact has been.
Now let's talk a little bit about the aviation sector. As you mentioned, it certainly will be one of the industries especially hard hit by this pandemic. Now, experts are saying that it could take as long as 5 years to recover. But what are your thoughts on what's going to happen to Africa's airlines going forward?
I think the COVID crisis has effectively disrupted aviation business, and I think after this, aviation companies and most of the commercial airline companies have to rethink the business model after this, and most certainly they will probably need government support initially, and a number of governments in the continent are rolling to some extent some sort of business rescue plans. Kenya, of course, being one of them, and South Africa. So I think initially they'll need some government support to get them on feet. But I think 5 years for me is too long. I think once we have some light at the end of this tunnel, I think aviation will strictly pick up. And also remember that global fuel prices are very low right now, which is very good for the aviation sector because fuel is a big portion of the expenditure. I think that 5 years for me is too long. I think I'm looking at probably a period of 12 months. A number of airlines should be able to start picking up, and the travel business should be able to pick up. If not the tourism business, but the commercial, the conference side of the business should be able to pick up.
Well, that's certainly an optimistic point of view. Now, moving on, experts are saying also that the world will not be back to business as usual, at least for the rest of the year. Some experts are saying that. What do you think this means for Africa's economies, given the size of our economies compared to the Western world, for example? Are trade and movement restrictions less likely to protect our economies? And how do you think we'll fare in surviving this crisis?
I think there's a lot that has happened after this crisis. One of them is that obviously Africa is affected because Africa's most of our economies in the continent are commodity driven. And number one is the oil price. We see where the oil price is. It's hitting a number of producers in the continent, especially Nigeria and Angola. So they will have to think about how do you survive outside oil. A number of countries like Kenya, which has a huge export business to Europe, are also suffering right now because there's no demand. And I think also you look at the global supply chain that has been massively disrupted. We've just realized that, it was a known fact, but we just come to the fore that we actually get a lot of our primary goods from China. And talk about Kenya, where early in this year, a number of ships were not able to come from China, and that has impacted, for instance, manufacturing. And a number of manufacturers had to source their raw materials elsewhere, but at a price, paying a premium for that. I think one of the key elements is this, that if we have Africa's economy has to look at inward production. And we've seen this is very possible in Kenya, for instance, today. We're able to produce masks internally, which is a bit of a miracle here. And the key thing here is that internal production price has to be elevated from this.
Well, as always, thank you so much for joining us, George, and thank you for your insights. That was George Bodo. He's a director at Carl Street Research and Analytics, joining us on Skype there. And now let's take a look at our corporate headlines today. South Africa's Competition Commission has reached an agreement with MTN to reduce data prices from the 1st of May. South Africa's second largest mobile operator will reduce its 1 GB monthly prepaid bundle to about $5. It will also offer all customers zero-rated access to up to 500 public benefit organization websites, as well as others focusing on education, healthcare, and job recruitment. And social network giant Facebook has announced that it will invest $390,000 to help South African news organizations navigate the economic impact of COVID-19. Now, as part of these funds, Facebook will work with the International Center for Journalists. The plan will see the nonprofit organization provide $140,000 to publishers, as well as $250,000 video training programs for roughly 10,000 journalists across Africa, who of course are covering COVID-19 through video reporting. And Ireland's Ryanair is planning to cut 3,000 jobs and reduce staff pay by up to a fifth. In response to the COVID-19 pandemic, the airline expects to operate less than 1% of its flight schedule between April and June. That's due to ongoing travel restrictions before returning to a meaningful schedule in July. When Ryanair does return, the budget carrier says passengers can expect to see significant price discounting for its fares. And finally, Apple shares were down more than 2% on Thursday. That's after the company reported a slight increase in second quarter revenue to $58.3 billion. At the moment, Apple stores around the world, except in China and one location in South Korea, are closed until further notice. Now, shares of the company have also declined by 9% over the past 3 months as the COVID-19 pandemic hits demand. And that is a look at our corporate headlines. We are heading into a quick break now, still coming up on the show. A MasterCard report shows a drastic increase in South Africa's contactless payments. And Algeria reopens economic and commercial activity amid the COVID-19 pandemic.
The world economy as we know it is about to change. Global business reports highlight emerging markets, developing countries, and dynamic sectors worldwide. We feature top analysts and newsmakers to provide perspectives on every facet of business. From an on-the-ground perspective, we provide you with balanced and objective assessments. Fast, sharp, and insightful. Global business, only on CGTN.
Every story starts out like this.
Okay. We'll head up now.
But beyond the rush of the numbers, there's always a more fundamental question. What happened? Who has been affected? When market-moving decisions are made, who's responsible? And why?
Let's get some reaction on ground. Joining us in Johannesburg is Sutra. Hello, Naro.
This is how all stories begin. See how they end. Only on Global Business.
There's more to this place than just glorious landscapes. There's more to it than just, say, Table Mountain or glorious, endless salt flats. There's more to it than countries that are home to some of the deepest mines in the world. There is so much more to this place, even if it is home to some of the finest diamonds on the planet. It is the sheer diversity of the people who call Southern Africa home, and the relentless drive to make it a better place that make it so special. And we know that because this too is home. No one knows Southern Africa like we do. CGTN, see the difference.
Africa is the nexus of enterprise, and global business will tell you why it matters.
From the mega investment projects to multi-billion-dollar mergers and acquisitions.
Africa today collects, just in terms of revenues from taxes alone, $545 billion a year. If you take 10% of that and you devote it to the energy sector, problem solved.
All this on Global Business, weekdays at this time on CGTN. Welcome back to Global Business Africa. Now, as countries impose necessary restrictions on social distancing in order to limit the spread of the coronavirus, a growing number of consumers in South Africa have turned to contactless payments for everyday purchases. According to a new survey by MasterCard, nearly 89% of South Africans have gone contactless to pay for groceries, 60% for pharmaceutical items, 39% for other retail items, 15% for fast food and 8% for transport. Now, MasterCard also saw a 40% jump in contactless payments, including tap to pay and mobile pay in the first quarter of this year. The credit card giant says 80% of contactless transactions are under $25, a range that is typically dominated by cash. Well, let's get some more insight into these numbers. We are joined by Mark Elliott, the division president for MasterCard Southern Africa. He joins us via Skype. Great to have you on the show with us, Mr. Elliott. Now, undoubtedly, the use of contactless payments, that has exploded in the wake of coronavirus, and it's pretty obvious why. But give us a sense of what are some of those interesting trends on consumer behavior that emerged from this study.
Good evening, and thanks for having me. So I think some of the interesting trends are that, what you see from the survey is that customer behavior is recognizing that contactless payments are a cleaner way to pay. And so what we've seen is that up to 20% of customers polled actually haven't used cash since the pandemic, and 44% are actually using contactless. Change in behavior is that actually customers are looking for retailers where they can do contactless payments because it's a cleaner way to pay. And also, if they have a contactless card in their wallet, they might be using that card rather than a card which doesn't have that contactless opportunity.
Well, is it clear what multiple ways we're seeing these payments being made, and in what particular establishments this shift of behavior has been observed?
Sure. So I think, we've had quite a strict lockdown here in South Africa, and so we kind of know what's open. So it's in the multi-lane grocery where we've seen obviously a lot of contactless. But having said that, there are a lot of other essential services who are also able to provide contactless payments. And as you also mentioned, this is an opportunity not only for the card payment, but also to use the mobile phone to tap to pay as well.
Now, as I mentioned earlier, this does not come as a surprise given the current environment we are in now. But as a result of coronavirus, we've also seen consumer spending being impacted. Give me a sense of how this has, coupled with the jump in contactless payments, impacted on MasterCard's bottom line so far this year.
Sure. So, just staying with contactless for a second, we've actually seen contactless payments in this quarter compared to the same quarter last year have increased by about 13 times. So that just gives you a quantum of the overall increase in contactless. More broadly in payments, we've stopped traveling. So that's led to a deterioration of our cross-border volumes and some of our switch volumes. But our services business has held up really well. And we released our earnings just a few days ago, so more details are available of that separately.
Now, unlike Kenya, where, of course, services like M-Pesa have dominated payments, so we're not seeing such a major shift, South Africa is a little different. So what do you expect after this lockdown ends? Do you think we'll see people slowly returning to what they normally used before? Do you see this trend, of course, persisting?
Sure. So I think the contactless experience is actually a fantastic experience if you've ever used it. And so what we see is that once we've organized, if you like, the ecosystem, both on the payment side and on the acquiring side of the payment, which we have now done in South Africa, then we can transact in a contactless way pretty much everywhere. We expect this trend to continue. We actually think this may provide the tipping point, which we're anticipating at some time very soon. We'll start to see a much higher level of contactless transactions into the future. We have many countries around the world where contactless really is the most prevalent type of transaction. You can see that we are really, replacing cash payments already below $25. My expectation is that over time that could go all the way up to $100. And because contactless is such a fantastic experience, it'll continue to proliferate.
Well, we'll certainly catch up with you then to find out what happens with the trend going forward. Thank you so much for joining us today on the show. That's Mark Elliott. He is the division president of MasterCard in Southern Africa. He, of course, joined us via Skype. Well, let's move on now. Still in South Africa, the country is seeking over $5 billion from multilateral lenders to battle the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. CGTN's Angelo Coppola has more on where this funding might come from and how it may be spent.
In a drive to find funding to fight COVID-19, the South African National Treasury Department made several parliamentary presentations at the end of April about how and when and where they would source the much-needed money from. The Treasury Director General Dondo Mogojane explained that $4.2 billion would come from the IMF, $1 billion would come from the BRICS New Development Bank, and $50 million would possibly be raised from the World Bank.
South Africa normally runs a current account deficit. Right now we're importing far less, but the fact is in future we're also going to export less, and we're going to need that money to pay for our imports. So we need dollars. We've also got debt that's in dollars, not just government debt, but normal company debt.
The current weakness of the currency could play into the country's hands.
With the rand being so weak and the dollar now strong, we might actually end up paying back less than we lent. So it will be like a little bit of a subsidy to us in a different way. But even if we don't, the interest rate is very, very favorable. And the terms are favorable too. So I think it's important that we make use of that and not try the normal market thing.
While funding the healthcare fight and servicing debt is important, there are other areas where the money could be used.
We also need to find some way of getting that money to our businesses at low interest rate loans and subsidies, because we need our businesses to pull through, because it's far easier keeping jobs than it is creating new ones. And with South African forecasts from our government even showing that we're going to lose between 3 and 7.1 million jobs, we really, really need to keep businesses going, because otherwise we won't have money to deal with other things, and we will end up in more poverty, and that poverty will end up with more diseases and more deaths than COVID-19 could ever give us.
When that foreign funding does come through, it's important that it's applied in the right place to have the maximum benefit. If that doesn't happen, those small and medium enterprises, the ones that generate all those employment opportunities, will be lost. I'm Angelo Coppola for CGTN in Parkhurst, South Africa.
Now, Algeria's government plans to gradually reopen economic and commercial activity during the coronavirus pandemic. The decision to expand the list of business sectors and commercial stores aims to mitigate and limit the impact of the crisis on their owners. There has been some mixed reaction to the government's decision to relax some of those regulations. Let's take a listen.
The reopening of markets is important to me, and I'm very happy that life has returned here. Since the start of the confinement, my family has been suffering with no income, and I was suffering financially. Today, thank God, things have started to return to normal, and despite many criticisms, I consider the decision is rational. and in the best interests of those who have a very simple income.
We have been severely affected by the quarantine phase and the closure of our trade, and I have no monthly income other than this profession. Today I return to my profession, and I hope this nightmare will end soon.
I am in favor of the decision to open up the markets for certain types of trade necessary for the citizen, and not for everybody. With the distribution of medical masks, because the presence of many people in the same place in the markets and stores will bring us back to square zero, and we will have to repeat the quarantine process from the start, and this is worrying.
You are watching Global Business Africa. Let's head into a quick break now, but still to come on the show. The price of oil jumps on some signs of a pickup in fuel demand. And ExxonMobil breaks ground on a $10 billion chemical complex in southern China.
Again, he can holding guns. Machine guns from police forces toward the protesters.
Were you worried about your life at that particular time? Not at all.
What is your assessment of the state of the continent today?
Africa has the potential to power itself.
Excuse me.
Business in Africa is at a crossroads. We celebrate those who are adopting and thriving despite the challenges, from grassroots to big businesses. Global Business takes you along for the ride as we track the making of a giant. Only on CGTN.
How will your world change today? What happens here? What happens there? Or what do you make happen for yourself? If it matters to you, it matters to us too. Your stories are the stories that need to be told. Africa Live. Find your voice.
And just about 5:30, let's recap today's top headlines. Tunisia says a national plan to ease restrictions will gradually take place as of May 4th. It will be implemented in 3 stages up until the 14th of July. Now, the new strategy follows the success of measures taken by the government to stem the spread of the pandemic. And South Africa's school calendar has been adjusted to save the academic year. Grade 7 and grade 12 pupils are now likely to go back to school on the 1st of June. The new proposals by the Education Department will see school administration staff return to work next Monday. The schools need at least a month to prepare for the return of students. And in Nigeria, a total of 113 health workers have tested positive for COVID-19. That is according to the country's Ministry of Health. They are part of the nearly 2,000 coronavirus cases recorded in the country so far. That's a recap of today's top headlines. Now, oil prices jumped on Friday, extending the previous session's gains. It comes as major producers begin output cuts to offset a slump in fuel demand, which of course was triggered by the coronavirus pandemic. Nonetheless, prices gave up some of their earlier gains as May began, with more of the volatility that made April one of the most turbulent months in the history of oil trading. Brent crude for July delivery was up about 22 cents at $26.7 a barrel in early trading. U.S. crude for June delivery, on the other hand, rose about 34 cents to around $19.18 a barrel. Now, elsewhere, multinational oil and gas corporation ExxonMobil has broken ground on its solely funded chemical complex in southern China. The complex, with a total investment of about $10 billion, will be built in 2 phases, as CGTN's He Weiwei now explains.
It's a mega project. This $10 billion petrochemical complex being built by ExxonMobil will be completed in 2 phases. By the end of the first phase, which is set for 2023, some 1.6 million tons of ethylene are expected to be produced each year.
This is a world-class petrochemical complex solely funded by ExxonMobil. It will help China reduce its reliance on petrochemical imports.
Many companies came to Huizhou seeking investment opportunities. It's a sign that COVID-19 is gradually under control inside our country, and China has become a favorable destination for foreign investment across the world.
This is so far the largest petrochemical project solely funded by a U.S. enterprise in China. Guangdong provincial government is working on facilitating even more foreign invested projects.
Since the outbreak of the coronavirus, we have helped over 50 multinational enterprises in solving their difficulties, especially in logistics, labor, raw materials, prevention gear, supply chain, and so forth.
Huizhou neighbors the city of Shenzhen, China's innovation and tech hub. In a video conference call, ExxonMobil's chairman said that China's infrastructure and supportive policies have created a conducive environment for investment. And it's these reasons that have allowed his company to seek continued and long-term investment in China. He Weiwei, CGTN, Huizhou.
Well, let's head to Australia now. The country's latest unemployment figures are better than expected in the face of the COVID-19 pandemic. But experts are cautioning that the numbers don't reflect the true impact to the country's workforce or its economy or what lies ahead. Here's Greg Navarro explaining.
For Renee Howell, working at the Wildlife Sydney Zoo is much different since the zoo closed its doors to the public earlier this month to help prevent the spread of COVID-19.
Before the closure, we were one big team of 3 divisions, but now we're 2 teams of all of the divisions combined.
While Howell still has a job, a growing number of Australians are not as lucky. The Australian government estimates that about 800,000 people have already lost their jobs, despite March's unemployment figures coming in ahead of expectations at just over 5%.
And that was before the shutdown of activities really got underway in the second half of the month.
Government measures aimed at slowing the spread of the virus effectively shut down the hospitality and tourism industries, leading to widespread business closures and job losses.
And if all of those people whose jobs were lost were officially classified as unemployed, that would probably be enough to put the unemployment rate up to somewhere north of 9%.
The Reserve Bank of Australia agrees, predicting the next round of official numbers due out in June will better reflect the impacts from a global pandemic and push the nation's unemployment rate to near 10%.
Government business.
Australia's government has released several economic stimulus packages aimed at offsetting the impacts, including rising unemployment, by essentially freezing the economy. That includes a multi-billion-dollar government wage subsidy to help more than 6 million Australians.
This JobKeeper or wage subsidy is effectively like a shield to protect workers and businesses during the pandemic and keep workers attached to their employer so that when the economy recovers, they'll be able to go back to work with the same employer rather than having to find a new job.
Despite government efforts to ensure a speedy economic recovery, economists believe the impacts to some sectors, including tourism, will linger for some time. Greg Navarro, CGTN, Sydney.
Now, millions of out-of-work rideshare drivers in the U.S. are struggling to collect unemployment benefits during this pandemic. When Congress passed a $2 trillion stimulus bill in March, it expressly cleared so-called gig workers, in quotes, to be able to collect jobless pay. But in practice, it's proving more difficult, especially in California, where a new law already demands these workers to be counted as regular employees. Our correspondent, Edis Tiantan, explains.
We are here because we didn't get our rights.
El Alaudi is among nearly 500,000 rideshare drivers in California, working for companies like Uber and Lyft. With hardly anyone on the move since the pandemic shutdown, most of them have been out of work, but struggling to claim any unemployment benefits.
I did not get anything, and now we have nothing. Nobody gets even a penny from the government, federal's money, or from the employment insurance. I talk about people like me, millions of people, they didn't get any penny.
El Alaudi has been organizing protests with other drivers since the shutdown.
For today, protest for safety. We got masks.
They brought protective gear so workers would come out to protest despite the risks. But the honking from their cars in front of the Labor Department fell on deaf ears. Even though the state has passed a law recognizing them as employees, they haven't been treated as such because Uber and Lyft continue to fight the mandate.
The employer is also supposed to be paying into the unemployment fund for every employee that they have. Now, come January 1st, Lyft and Uber have been fighting the designation of employment, obviously because they want to protect their business model. But that's led to an awful situation where drivers are being told that you have no money paid into the system because your employer has not reported any income.
Uber rolled out an updated sick pay policy that only covers drivers who've either contracted COVID-19 or been ordered to self-quarantine. But El Alaudi says he hasn't been able to benefit from that program either, despite just recently being ordered to self-quarantine because a family member has COVID-19.
Because one of the family members, he got positive with COVID-19. And I was trying to get help from rideshare companies, the one I work with. And guess what? The reply was with the email, you're not qualified.
Across the country, gig workers are reporting difficulties claiming some of the $2.2 trillion approved by Congress that includes them in the jobless pool. Many states are simply overwhelmed by the record surges in unemployment. It is Tianshan, CGTN, Los Angeles.
Well, let's move on now and take a look at how commodity markets performed today. Oil prices continue to slow their decline. That's on signs that the U.S. crude glut is not growing as quickly as expected, and of course of a rise in fuel demand going forward. Now, Brent crude did fall almost 2% today, but experts are saying if the already stretched storage capacity shows signs of getting fuller every week, a rise in prices cannot be sustainable for long, as the problem, of course, is not really resolved. Now, gold prices edged lower today as risk appetite was boosted by positive trial results of an experimental COVID-19 treatment. Investors also took stock of data showing factory activity in China expanded for a second straight month in April as more businesses resume work. Well, let's head into a quick break now. Still coming up on the show. Egypt's wheat farming is one of the few sectors reaping the rewards during the coronavirus pandemic. And a Nigerian fashion designer joins the luxury face mask trend to help disadvantaged communities.
Images may appear to be identical, but looks can be deceiving. The difference is not always obvious. It has to be discovered. There are always different sides to a story. We put the focus on the details. To see more, to understand better. CGTN. See the difference.
The greatest journeys, the greatest sights, the greatest adventures.
Here in Qanater, this weir allows the locals to walk on water.
We're far more than just TV news. We're your passport to the wonders of Africa.
To bring you stories of struggle, survival and hope.
So let's explore. CGTN. See the difference.
You don't find the stories of North Africa by sitting on the sidelines. No one else will take you where we can in North Africa. And no one else will show you what it's all about. CGTN, see the difference.
Now, unfazed by the coronavirus, Egypt's farmers have geared up for the wheat harvest season. They kicked off the exercise this month, largely untouched by the coronavirus disruptions that have been experienced by growers globally. Now, President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi is calling on those farmers to sell every grain they can to the government. CGTN's Daniela Pearson has that story.
In a small village 125 kilometers from the capital city of Cairo, farmers are sprawling across the fields to harvest wheat, seemingly unfazed by the coronavirus pandemic. This is because these farmers were exempt from a nationwide curfew, allowing them to work into the night after breaking their fast during the holy month of Ramadan. However, most farmers are skeptical of selling their produce to the state.
We do sell the wheat to the government, but it is a price that is not rewarding because it's too little. The cost of farming is up and prices have increased for everybody. One sack of fertilizer is very expensive. It is not for free. And hiring someone to work is also very costly. It is not like before.
Egypt, being the world's largest wheat importer, expects its local harvest to yield around 9.2 million tons this season. The government hopes to buy around 3.6 million tons for its multi-million-dollar food subsidy program, aimed at boosting food security in the country.
I call upon the wheat farmers with honesty. I am calling upon them to consider decreasing the amount that they store and sell the remaining amount to the supply ministry. While we are well organized and have sufficient reserves, it is because of this current uncertainty that is expected to last until December that I say to farmers, it would be better if you don't hold on to more than necessary and instead sell it to the government that will store it and it will benefit many. Thank you.
Farmers with large parcels of land say they are more likely to sell significant amounts of their yields to the government, while those with smaller patches are more likely to keep their crops. But farmers are also facing a challenge this season.
The harvest this year isn't very rewarding because of the rain. It affected the wheat plant as the ears were heading and it lasted 2 to 3 days. The amount of water that gathered was unbelievable, so the harvest is not as rewarding as it is every year.
According to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Egypt consumes an estimated 20 million tons of wheat annually and imports around 12 million tons. With many grain producers curbing exports due to the coronavirus lockdowns, Egypt is now focused on building its strategic reserves. Daniela Pearson, CGTN.
They have become unexpectedly must-have accessories amidst this pandemic, whether we like it or not. Now, amongst the fashion-conscious, though, demand for more stylish and cheerful forms of face protection has now exploded. As CGTN's Kelechi Makalam reports, one luxury fashion brand is filling that niche in Africa's largest economy.
The ongoing production of 3-ply reusable face masks by Tollaway, one of Nigeria's high-end fashion brands. They're known for their bespoke lingerie and clothing designs. The company was on the verge of shutting down operations due to the coronavirus outbreak, but the management was inspired to join the global efforts in flattening the curve of COVID-19.
It was really a case of gauging the temperature and knowing the right thing to do at that time. The priority at that time we felt for the world was to focus on survival, to focus on not spreading the virus more than it already had. So we decided to just convert our production space into a face mask production facility based on what we had been seeing, what we'd seen happening in New York State with the Governor Cuomo asking everybody to start wearing face masks, the doctors saying that they wanted face masks. We just knew, even if it was going to be 2 or 3 weeks later, that same demand was going to come to Nigeria. And look at where we are today.
The brand produces about 5,000 pieces of African-inspired face masks daily. Depending on the fabrics and designs, they're sold between $3 and $5 a piece. Aside from paying their staff, some of the proceeds are donated to help support communities struggling amid the coronavirus pandemic.
A percentage of all the proceeds made from sales of masks goes straight into our charity fund, which we've called the Tollaway Emergency Relief Fund. And in partnership with a foundation called Isodokon Foundation, we've identified some communities and organizations and shelters that will be donating 2 weeks worth of provisions whenever we go and visit them, as well as masks that obviously masks that made by us. We donate them to those people as well. So we've already visited one community in Badagry called Shibiri. It's a community of 137 families.
Nigeria recently made it mandatory to wear face masks in public places. That's in line with WHO's safety recommendation to reduce the spread of the virus. So a lot of designers are now following the path of Tollaway, finding mask production a desirable venture at this time. Kelechi Makalam, CGTN Lagos, Nigeria.
Now, South Africa's tourism ministry says all activities in the sector are likely to be grounded until December. Of course, the sector has hosted a webinar now on tourism-related issues and was joined by hundreds of people involved in the sector. CGTN's Yulisa Jamela was there and brings us the details.
Tourism is one of the biggest contributors to the economy here in South Africa. The outbreak of the coronavirus that has brought along restrictions in terms of travel has crippled that industry. And South Africa's tourism minister believes that this strain will be around for a long while still and will continue to adversely affect the industry.
We all know that the travel and tourism has already suffered the most devastating setbacks since the outbreak of COVID-19 pandemic, yet the full impact of the pandemic to the tourism sector is still yet unknown. We are anticipating to say this is what is happening now, but how long it will take, all that is dependent on how we respond to the virus.
This country's international tourism season for 2020 only consisted of January and February due to the coronavirus pandemic, which arrived in early March in these shores. The World Travel and Tourism Council has asserted that Africa's tourism industry is expected to have massive job losses. The council is the global forum for the tourism sector.
The global nature of the pandemic means that the measures to curb the spread, such as travel restrictions and border closures, have been worldwide phenomenon. This means that any recovery planning that is not in line with global coordinated efforts will be a futile exercise. And this is critical that we need to note. So the consistent theme emerging from this global institution is for countries to develop a coordinated approach to the recovery of tourism sector.
When further probed about job losses in the tourism industry, Kubai Ngubane said one needs to keep a delicate balance between protecting people from the virus and enabling economic activities.
It's not difficult to predict what will happen to us. Escalation in terms of economic loss for us, we're going to see a lot of job losses. As we're seeing that this is because the lockdown which were imposed to contain the spread of virus curtail both the supply and the demand side of tourism market. In essence, the lockdown has rendered the tourism industry ineffective. So we've closed, the borders are closed, the skies are closed. And only what we see in the skies is those who are being repatriated either back into the country or are repatriated out of the country.
The Department of Tourism has established a $10.8 million COVID-19 financial fund to help small and medium-sized businesses in the sector.
In the meantime, we need to create mechanisms to protect the most vulnerable segments of the sector, such as SMMEs, self-employed women and youth. We've set aside 200 million as a fund.
The minister believes that local traveling, once lockdown is over, will be key to re-establishing the tourism industry. Because of the nature of the tourism industry, the sector is likely going to be the last to be welcomed back into the economy, especially considering the social distance issues and travel restrictions. Yolisa Njamela for CGTN in Johannesburg, South Africa.
And before we go, let's take a look at how developing world currencies performed today. Emerging market currencies slipped on fears of a renewed Sino-US trade war, of course stoked by US President Donald Trump on Friday. South Africa's rand fell more than 1% to the dollar. We also saw MSCI's index of developing world currencies retreating about 0.5%. That's having gained 0.6% in April. Now, traders do say while emerging market currencies had benefited from some recovery in risk appetite over the past month, a renewed Sino-US trade tiff could worsen the economic damage caused by the coronavirus and, of course, result in massive capital outflows from the developing world. Well, that's it for this edition of Global Business Africa. Remember, you can send your feedback to the contacts on your screen. You can also follow us on our various digital media platforms. From me, Uche Okoronkwo, and the rest of the team, thanks for watching.